I sometimes close my eyes, and I am back there again, standing on the curb of a sunlit street in the middle of the 1950s, watching the parade of cars glide by as if the whole world had turned into a moving picture. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline, the sweetness of blooming trees, and the faint salt of French fries drifting from a diner down the block. The engines rumbled like voices in conversation, each one distinct, some smooth, some deep and growling, others bright and eager. The 1950s were alive, and you could taste that life in the very air. America was booming. Families were growing, neighborhoods were springing up like fields of flowers, and nothing expressed that new spirit of optimism more than the cars that filled every driveway and rolled proudly down every main street in the country. Back then, a car was never just a tool to take you to work or to the store. It was a statement, a rolling extension of yourself, a declaration of how you wanted the world to see you. Each car had a face, a personality, a soul that spoke through its chrome grille and gleaming headlights. Walk down any block in the 1950s and you'd see a whole neighborhood of characters lined up at the curb. Cadillacs smiling with confidence, Chevrolets grinning with youthful energy, Buicks with dignified pride, Oldsmobiles with a dependable grin, and sometimes a Studebaker with that daring, futuristic smirk. The cars reflected the people, and the people reflected the cars, and the line between the two blurred until it felt like the machines themselves were alive companions on the road of life. The Chevrolet Bel Air became the sweetheart of the decade, and it deserved the title. By 1955, the Bel Air had transformed from a modest model into a shining star. Two-tone paint schemes in aqua and cream, red and white, or turquoise and black made the cars sparkle like candy in the sun. The chrome trim wrapped around them like jewelry, and the white wall tires framed the whole picture. If you were lucky enough to ride in one of the 55s, 56s, or 57s Bel Airs, you knew the feeling of pride that swept over you when you turned a corner and saw people glance up from the sidewalks. And the 57 Bel Air, my goodness, those fins rose with just enough flare to catch the last rays of sunset, and the twin rockets of chrome that ran along the sides made the car look ready to blast into tomorrow. Kids doodled those tail fins in the school notebooks. Teenagers dreamed of cruising down Main Street in one on a Saturday night, radio tuned to Elvis, windows rolled down, the world stretched wide open. The Bel Air wasn't just a car. It was the picture of youth, style, and the American dream, painted in metal and chrome. But the Bel Air had competition for attention. Cadillac was a king, the undisputed symbol of luxury and status, and the Eldorado was the jewel of the crown. Every curve of that car seemed to shout confidence. Every tail fin stretched toward the sky like a declaration that the future was ours to claim. By 1959, those fins soared higher than the roofs of some porches, ending in rocket-like taillights that glowed red as if they could burn holes in the night. Slide into an Eldorado, and you found yourself wrapped in soft leather, surrounded by dials and switches that seemed futuristic, with power windows, power seats, power steering, luxuries that felt like magic in those days. To own a Cadillac Eldorado in the 50s was to step into a higher world. It wasn't just transportation. It was royalty gliding past the commoners. People would stop conversations to watch one float down the street, and children like me would stare until it disappeared, imagining the kind of man who sat behind that wide steering wheel, confident and calm, his hat tilted just so. To us, Cadillac was not a car company. It was a promise of what life could be if you worked hard and dreamed big. Yet, not everyone wanted size and luxury. Some of us longed for freedom, for the feel of the wind through our hair, and Ford gave us the Thunderbird. Introduced in 1955, the Thunderbird was something entirely new. It wasn't a pure sports car like the European imports, but it wasn't a family sedan either. It was personal, intimate, and thrilling. With only 2 seats and a sleek convertible top, the Thunderbird felt like a declaration of independence. Slide behind the wheel, drop the top, and you could imagine yourself driving straight into the horizon. On Friday nights, you'd see a Thunderbird parked outside the diner, and you knew the couple inside was living the dream. Laughter, milkshakes, rock and roll on the jukebox, the open road waiting for them as soon as the burgers were gone. The Thunderbird carried not just passengers, but the spirit of adventure, the idea that life was meant to be tasted, savored, and sung along with the radio. Performance, too, had its champions. The Chrysler 300, launched in 1955, was nicknamed the letter car and quickly became known as the gentleman's hot rod. Beneath its sleek, respectable body beat the heart of a powerful HEMI V8 engine that could leave lesser cars trembling at the stoplight. When one of those rolled down Main Street, you could hear the difference. The rumble was deeper, prouder, more confident, and heads turned without anyone even realizing they were turning. The Chrysler 300 proved that you could have power without giving up class, speed without losing respectability. It was a car for men who wanted both a racer's thrill and a businessman's dignity. I still remember the first time I saw one launch from a stoplight, the tires squealing, the nose lifting just slightly before it smoothed into a graceful glide down the boulevard. Even the air seemed to shiver with excitement. Buick was no slouch either. The Roadmaster was a statement on wheels, wide and sweeping with that famous chrome sweep spear running down its sides. The interiors were soft and comfortable, and the Dynaflow transmission made acceleration so smooth you hardly felt the car shift at all. The Roadmaster didn't shout. It spoke with calm authority, the kind of authority that made you feel secure just sitting in the back seat. Families chose Buicks for their prestige, for the way they said, "We have arrived." I remember my uncle had one, and when he drove us to Sunday church, I felt like I was stepping out of a limousine. Buick made every owner feel a little taller, a little prouder. Then there was Oldsmobile with its Rocket 88, a car that changed the game entirely. By putting a powerful V8 into a smaller body, Oldsmobile created something thrilling, something new. The Rocket 88 roared onto the scene in 1949 and carried its legend through the early 50s, often called the first real muscle car. The name alone carried excitement. You couldn't look at the Rocket badge on the fender without feeling a surge of energy. People even sang about it. One of the earliest rock and roll songs was named after it. The Rocket 88 made speed and performance accessible, gave the average man a taste of the racetrack on his daily commute. I can still see one idling at a light, its exhaust puffing little clouds of impatience, the driver's hand tapping the steering wheel in rhythm with the radio. Then the green light flashed, and the car leapt forward like it had wings. It was the sound of the future, the sound of America picking up speed, but the decade wasn't just ruled by the giants. Studebaker stood proudly apart, always daring to be different. In 1953, they introduced the Starliner Coupe, designed under Raymond Loewy's guidance, and it looked like it had arrived from another decade entirely. Low, sleek, futuristic, it made other cars look bulky and old-fashioned. To see one in person was to realize that cars could be art, that they didn't all have to follow the same mold. Later came the Golden Hawk, a car with sharp styling and plenty of power, a car that caught the eye of every teenager leaning against the wall outside the soda shop. Studebaker owners weren't following the crowd. They were setting themselves apart. I had a friend with a Silver Hawk, and whenever he parked it by the diner, a small crowd gathered, drawn not by chrome excess, but by bold uniqueness. In the 50s, being different was rare, and Studebaker gave people the courage to stand out. And then there was the little Nash Metropolitan, small enough to look like a toy in a land of giants. Imported in part from England, painted in bright two-tone colors like coral and white or aqua and cream, it was the car that made people smile. It wasn't powerful, it wasn't imposing, but it had charm, and sometimes charm is more powerful than horsepower. You'd see a Metropolitan parked between a Buick and a Cadillac, and it looked like a child standing between two grown men. But people loved it. Kids pointed, mothers admired it, and drivers laughed with joy when they saw it in their driveways. It proved that cars could be fun, that not everything had to be big to be beautiful. If you loved racing, you couldn't ignore the Hudson Hornet. With its low, step-down design, it hugged the road like nothing else, giving it handling advantages that left competitors spinning in the dust. On NASCAR tracks in the early 50s, the Hornet was a legend. Driven by champions like Marshall Teague, it won race after race, year after year, and the name Hudson Hornet became synonymous with speed, strength, and victory. But off the track, the Hornet still shone with elegant lines and broad curves. To own one was to carry a bit of that racing glory into your everyday life. When you pulled into a gas station with a Hudson Hornet, you felt like part of a winning team. Of course, all of these cars lived in a world that added to their magic. The 1950s were the age of the drive-in theater, where cars lined up in neat rows, speakers hanging from windows, families and teenagers alike staring up at a massive silver screen under the stars. The glow of headlights faded into the dark as movies began, and the silhouettes of Chevrolets and Fords stretched against the flickering light. Couples curled together in the back seats, children fell asleep with popcorn on their laps, and engines occasionally purred to life as someone slipped out for more sodas. Cars and movies, side by side, made the decade unforgettable. Then there were the diners, neon signs buzzing pink and blue, waitresses gliding on roller skates, trays clipped to half-rolled windows. The smell of burgers and fries mixed with the faint tang of gasoline, and radios played the soundtrack of the decade. Elvis, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly. Cars weren't parked outside diners. They were part of the diners, the other half of the experience. Conversations flowed through open windows from one car to another. Engines idled softly in rhythm with the jukebox. It wasn't just a meal. It was community on wheels. Gas was cheap, highways were opening, and the world felt boundless. Families piled into Buicks and Oldsmobiles for Sunday drives through the countryside. Teenagers borrowed the keys to Chevrolets and Fords to circle Main Street in endless loops of pride. Fathers polished chrome on Saturday mornings, and mothers beamed with pride when neighbors paused to admire the family car. The machine in the driveway wasn't just metal. It was memory, identity, a symbol of a family's journey. Now, I know today's cars are safer, faster, more efficient. They've got air conditioning, navigation systems, backup cameras. But when I think of cars, my heart doesn't leap for gadgets. It leaps for tailfins catching the last glow of sunset, for chrome bumpers reflecting neon diner lights, for the steady rumble of a V8, carrying laughter through an open night. Cars today may be smarter, but the cars of the 1950s were alive. They had faces, they had voices, they had soul. And sometimes, when I'm driving down the road in this modern world, I'll spot a restored Bel Air or a gleaming Thunderbird, and suddenly I'm 18 again. The jukebox is playing, the neon is glowing, the world is wide open, and I am standing at the curb with wide eyes and a racing heart, dreaming of the day I'll slide behind the wheel of a chrome-trimmed dream and take on the open road. That, my friend, is what the 1950s were all about. What made those cars even more unforgettable was the way they drew on the world around them. Tailfins, for example, weren't just decoration. They were inspired by the sky. Designers like Harley Earl at General Motors looked at the twin tails of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter plane from World War II and thought, why not bring that same feeling of flight to the road? And so, cars began to sprout fins, small at first, but by the late 50s, they reached toward the heavens like rocket ships preparing for launch. The fins weren't practical, but they weren't meant to be. They were imagination in sheet metal, proof that we were aiming upward. To a boy staring at a '59 Cadillac's dramatic wings, it felt like America could do anything. Those same years brought another revolution, the interstate highway system. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act, and suddenly the dream of coast-to-coast travel became reality. Wide ribbons of smooth concrete stretched farther and farther, connecting towns, states, lives. Families packed up their Oldsmobiles and Buicks and set out on summer vacations, cruising along brand-new interstates that cut travel time in half. You could drive from one coast to the other without leaving 4 lanes of pavement. The cars of the 50s were built for that promise. Big trunks for luggage, powerful engines for long hauls, comfortable interiors for hours of riding. The highway and the automobile grew up together, hand in hand, and the freedom we felt was like nothing before. And comfort was changing fast. Before the 1950s, most cars didn't even have seat belts, let alone luxuries. But by mid-decade, things like automatic transmissions were becoming common. Buick's Dynaflow, Chevrolet's Powerglide, Chrysler's Torque Flight, names whispered like magic words. No more clutching and grinding gears. You just slid the lever and glided forward, smooth as silk. And then there was air conditioning, once reserved for the rarest limousines. By 1953, Cadillac offered it, and by the later 50s, you could find it in Oldsmobiles, Lincolns, and even Buicks. Imagine that. Cool air blowing through the cabin on a hot July afternoon while the rest of the world sweated on sidewalks. It felt like the future had arrived. Color, too, played its part. Cars weren't just black or gray anymore. The 50s exploded with color like a box of candy spilled onto the street. Two-tone, and even three-tone paint jobs became the rage. Turquoise and ivory, salmon pink with cream, metallic blues, mint greens, fiery reds. Interiors matched with bold vinyl and cloth. Dashboards gleamed with chrome and pastel trim. Parking lots looked like living rainbows. Neighbors didn't just talk about what model you bought. They admired your color choice, your style, your flair, and it gave each car a personality, made them part of the family. For the young, cars were more than family wagons. They were independents. The rise of hot rods and drag racing gave teenagers a whole new world. Boys bought old Fords and Chevys, stripped them down, souped them up with bigger carburetors and louder exhausts. On Friday nights, they lined up on country roads or the edge of town, engines revving, tires ready to bite. The flag dropped, and the cars leapt forward in a roar of fire and smoke. Magazines like Hot Rod fed the craze, and suddenly garages across America echoed with wrenches and dreams. Car clubs formed, jackets embroidered with names like Road Runners or Piston Pushers. To belong to a club was to belong to a family, a tribe defined by horsepower and chrome. Advertising joined the party, too. Automakers filled magazines and TV screens with glossy visions of the good life. Smiling families loading picnic baskets into their Chevrolets, glamorous couples stepping from their Cadillacs, rugged men conquering mountains in Jeeps and Studebakers. Taglines promised not just transportation, but identity. See the USA in your Chevrolet? Who could resist? Cars weren't sold as machines. They were sold as experiences, as dreams you could park in your driveway. Not every brand survived the decade, but even the ones that faded left their mark. Nash merged into American Motors, but who could forget the quirky Metropolitan? Packard, once a titan of luxury, struggled through the 50s, yet its cars still carried dignity. DeSoto, a proud member of Chrysler's family, offered stylish machines before vanishing in 1961. And Kaiser, with its bold colors and clever ideas, gave the world a taste of independent innovation. These names may be gone from the road today, but in memory they shine just as brightly as the giants. What ties it all together is the optimism of the era. The war was over, prosperity was rising, families were growing, and every car that rolled off the line seemed to say, "The future's yours." Chrome fins pointed skyward. V8 engines roared with confidence. Highways stretched to the horizon. Radios filled the air with new music. Everything felt possible, and cars carried that spirit on their shoulders. When I think of the 1950s now, I don't just think of the models or the engines. I think of the feeling of watching your father wash the Buick on a Saturday morning, hose spraying rainbows in the sun. The feeling of sitting in the back seat of a Cadillac with your feet barely touching the floor, dreaming of the day you'd have your own keys. The feeling of leaning on the hood of a Chevy Bel Air with friends, a milkshake in hand, the sound of laughter mixing with the rumble of engines, and the beat of rock and roll spilling from a jukebox. Cars today may be smarter, safer, cleaner, but the cars of the 1950s were alive in a way that spoke to the soul. They carried us not just down roads, but into dreams. They were more than metal and rubber. They were optimism made visible, hope shaped into steel, freedom painted in bright two-tone colors. And that's why, all these years later, I still close my eyes and return to those streets, to those nights under neon lights, to the roar of V8s and the sparkle of chrome. That's why, for me, the 1950s will always live on, in memory, in spirit, and in the cars that defined an era where everything seemed possible and the road ahead was endless.